Welcome everybody to today's webinar. We're going to give everyone just a few minutes to get logged in, and then we're going to get started. We still have some people joining us, so give us just a moment and we'll get started right at the top of the hour. Thank you so much. Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for attending today. We are very excited to have Jordan Uytterhagen joining us for our session. My name is Heather and I'm the Director of Member Engagement, and I'll be your moderator this afternoon. Before we get started, we want to thank you for being a valued member of ARMA and taking advantage of your membership by joining us. From our online education and our industry opportunities, we encourage you to connect and gain professional resources through your membership. If you have not already done so, I highly encourage you to visit arma.org and see all that ARMA has to offer. As well, we hope you join us in October, from October 9th to 11th for ARMA InfoCon in Detroit. This event is where networking, learning, deepening your knowledge, your industry knowledge takes place. And we have so much good content and programming planned. And personally, I'm most excited for the fun. We have events planned on Monday night to take a water tour of the famous Detroit Princess. And on Tuesday evening, we have a rare opportunity to take place at a private event at the Henry Ford Museum, which happens to be one of my favorite places in Detroit. If you're not familiar with the top-ranked museum, one of the top-ranked museums in the country, it is absolutely amazing. It's way more than just cars. It's actually a museum for American innovation, and it's truly spectacular. So if you haven't participated in ARMA InfoCon in the past, put your favorite memory. If you have participated in ARMA InfoCon in the past, we'd love to hear about your favorite ARMA memory. As well, everyone's burning questions today. Will the webinar be recorded? Yes. All professional members will receive access to the recording and the slides. And please check your email in the next couple of days for the Zoom link and addition for the recording. Before we get started here today, I do want to thank today's speaker and our sponsor for being here today. We cannot bring education and programming and events without the support of our business partners. And we hope when you are selecting products and services for your business that you consider partners like the Cadence Solutions who support you. So now, thank you so much for being here, Jordan. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Heather, for the intro. Hello, everybody. You may have seen me present before, a frequent presenter here with ARMA. Jordan Uytterhagen from Cadence Solutions. So today is going to be drinking from the fire hose of Microsoft Purview and kind of going through some of the foundational components of it. So we'll save questions till the end on this one. We'll get to them in the Q&A box if you want to put them in there. That gives us kind of a separate area to trigger them and respond to them. And after that, if we do want to go through and you want to contact me separately if I didn't answer your question, we're happy to answer those with myself or the team here at Cadence. So we'll start with just a few quick slides about us, and then we're going to get right into the agenda on Purview. So a bit about us and what makes Cadence different is actually started the company after going through a very poor implementation with a big vendor. They exhausted our budget and didn't implement a record solution that they'd promised to. So kind of got a little excited and motivated by that and started a company that goes out and does implementations, in my opinion, the way they should be, ethically and transparently. What we do generally is we implement Microsoft technology, specifically with Syntex, the new kid on the block from Microsoft, Purview, SharePoint, and Power Apps. And we're both a gold partner with Microsoft and a part of the Content Services Partner Program, which is an invite-only partnership program for Microsoft that focuses on IAM and RM and governance, so a little different than the traditional partner channels over at Microsoft. So today we're going to go through how to essentially manage your records in Purview. Purview is an ever-changing ecosystem within the 365 tenant. It's something that can create some challenges for you on your side of things as a records manager or an IT individual. And also on the vendor side with us, as we're constantly learning and don't really have release control of the new features and functions that are coming out. So we're going to cover a number of different topics today around the inside and really the guts of Purview. So we're going to go through and talk about the policy and label differences, so just general terminology, some of the actions you can take out of the retention side of things, the types of retention labels, how to essentially transition into the M365 file plan. And when I say that, I mean en masse, not individually. And some of the application methods for labeling documents, records, and getting into the more sensitive side of things. We're going to start with a quick poll question. So I'm just going to go launch this poll here. And I just want to kind of get a feel for who's seen Purview before, how comfortable you are in it. Like, have you seen this before? If you have, we may accelerate a few things. If you haven't, we'll go from there. So I'll give this a minute or so to answer. There's quite a few of you online, and looks like participation is good. All right, looks like we're about three quarters there. So I'm not sure if you can see it on the screen if Zoom puts that up there, but we've got 54% at no and 46% at yes. So almost right down the middle. So thanks for participating in that. So the slides I'm going to go through for the next 40 or 45 minutes or so are all focused on the governance side of Purview. Now, Purview is a large product that's ever evolving, and there's more in there than just RM and IM, but we're going to focus on those components today. This is a lot to take in an hour. We usually slow this down and go through this in depth with demonstrations between many of the slides, which I can talk about at the end, and how we're going to potentially get you into something like that later. Essentially with Purview, previously called Compliance Center, so the branding is a little different. The URL actually be called Compliance instead of Purview if you're navigating through the Microsoft 365 admin side of things. And really, we're there to protect and govern your data with Purview. So do you know your data? Can you discover it from a sensitivity side of things across the landscape? That includes the email inboxes, of course, OneDrive, SharePoint sites, Teams data. Can we protect it? So can we classify it effectively with either content type, sensitivity labels, and can we do that in a unified fashion? And that's really where 365 is changing, I think, some of the game inside the IM technology world. Can we prevent data loss? So there's data loss prevention policies. If you're doing your Googling on that, it's DLP is kind of the nomenclature for that. Can you apply encryption? Can you restrict access, such as things as if this pattern is in a document, don't allow it to be shared outside the organization. And what most of you are here for today, can we govern it? Can we put retention and policies around the documents turning into records that we actually want to monitor and eventually put through disposition? So we're going to focus today, of course, on the governance side of things. We're going to talk through the different components inside of Purview, specifically records management. There's also data classification in there, information protection, e-discovery, which is a presentation I'll be giving at InfoCon if you're there for the ARMA conference at InfoCon in Detroit. Data loss prevention, and then of course, auditing and searching, which is expanding in terms of features as well. So we're going to cover the records management side. We'll go through file plans. We'll talk about labels. We'll talk about policies, and we'll try to get all the way to destruction in the life cycle of those records as well. So before we get into that, I'm just going to launch a quick poll on the licensing side of things. So there is, as you know, in the Microsoft world, a ton of different licensing options. And I just want to make sure that if you're aware of the licensing you have, there's three options to this. I have E5, I have E3, or I don't know what I have. And we talk to all different kinds of clients that may come in and say, I want to do this, but I don't know what my license is. So we start to broker a conversation with IT and get going on a path of somewhat compliance in the licensing side of things, or something we can attain. Looks like we have most of you answering that one. So we got about almost half on E5, about 16% or so on E3, and just over a third that aren't quite sure what they have, which is pretty common. So I'll talk a bit about the license requirements. If you are going to build a business case on this internally, and you're trying to get from that E3 to E5, or you're not sure what you have, go talk to your system admin, even procurement. Will know. If you're with Microsoft, they'll have something called an enterprise agreement if you're a larger org that you renew every 3 to 5 years. And that's where you get the opportunity to trade up, true up or true down on license count as well as license level. So I'm going to bring this just in the context of licensing from a record side of things. We're an implementer. We don't get paid to sell licenses, but it is something that you can take back and have conversations with your appropriate folks to make sure you got the tools required to do what we're going to talk about today. So on the E5 side of things, automated records management essentially requires E5. So the end goal of doing automated records management is we want to just teach users, where do I put my stuff? And then the retention should take over, whether that's inheriting from a doc library, a site, an email, a OneDrive location. We don't want the user to go and tag each individual document as a record. It's not very successful from a change management perspective, or even just trusting that compliance is done properly. If you have an E3 license, we had a group of you there, and you add a document to a library where retention labels automatically applied, that user can be benefiting from an E5 service, so you could be quote unquote in violation of the license agreement with Microsoft. So I'll leave that to the more legal folks to have that discussion should that be happening. The differences between the two, so there was a rebranding of Office 365 into Microsoft 365. So the terms in the industry, as you're having a conversation over beverages, are almost interchangeable, but in reality, it's quite a bit different when you actually get under the hood on that. O365 is the original Office 365, and it doesn't include specific functions like Microsoft 365 does with additional security. There's some machine learning in there. Device management, so if you want mobile device management registered in, and general system management. So there are two differentiation levels there. And I've actually provided a few guides that you can go through. So there's a licensing guide and a feature comparison where you can actually go through that. If you're going to do records management out of the box Purview, you should look at going to E5. It's going to be the most successful in terms of the user experience side of things. In terms of costing for everything, if you're going through left and right side of this chart, you have the M365 side on the left, O365 on the right, and you can kind of see the check boxes here across the top. So just for general terminology, E3 is enterprise, and even E is enterprise. F is generally a field license. So if you're an organization that has a bunch of field workers, they're out there with mobile devices, iPads, whatever it may be, and they're using Microsoft technology, they may be on an F3 or an F1. Same on the O365 side. If you're a municipality and you have the Parks and Recreation crew out there doing their thing, they're not generally going to end up with a license like an office worker would that has a desktop and a formal desk in a building. So they end up with different functionality on the records side. Now, I've carved out about 10 or so features here from the records side within the ecosystem. Now, if I wanted to put all this out there, it'd be about 6 slides, and I'm not going to bore you to death with licensing check marks. But there is quite an extensive list here, which I did refer to on the previous slide. So essentially the difference between the M365 E5 and the O365 E5 is the machine learning, essentially trainable classifiers. And with Syntex coming on board, that'll be our next webinar next week. I can kind of show you how we can do that without necessarily needing to go all the way up to that license level. So a little more powerful technology they've spun out of some of the existing features. You can see on E5, essentially we end up with event-based retention, retention label disposition reviews, classifying data automatically. All these things are big wins for the end user that you're trying to get to participate in your governance project. We don't even actually have to tell them it's a governance project. We can just find a location to put things, train them to go there and put things in a new information architecture structure, and let the records retention just inherit onto that content. So this is some of the pricing here as well. Again, mileage may vary here in terms of your organization size and your relationship with Microsoft. Some of the goals when we get into records management is we want to transform that retention schedule into a Purview file plan, and we want to seamlessly classify those records based on an information architecture. So that's some of the goals that we end up with. We're going to start with that by understanding the difference between policies and labels. So when we get into a retention policy versus a retention label, so retention policy can be applied to a location, a site, a team, an M365 group, a mailbox. Generally, the end user isn't aware it's there, which is great. We can't trigger a disposition review at the end of the retention period. We can't declare content a record or regulatory record, and I'll touch on what those are in a second as well. And the retention start date can be based on the create or last modified date. So you get a bit of flexibility there. Now the retention label is a little bit different. It can be applied to an item in a location, so a folder, a documented email. The end user can see it and set it. So we can auto label it if we like as a retention label. We can give users the ability to relabel that as well. And additionally, we can trigger a disposition review at the end of the retention period. So what I would consider, and most would consider, standard records management. If we were going into or moving out of a traditional ECM system, they have this functionality already. So if you're moving on from something like a Laserfish or a Highland On base and you're moving into the M365 world, you want to start looking at the retention label functionality. We can declare content a record or a regulatory record, and we can start retention based on a number of different properties. So the create date, the last modified date, the labeled date, so the date the label was put on, which if we're auto labeling is the date we've actually put the content into the location as an end user, or an event date. So metadata, we can run this on metadata. An example of that is contract end date plus 3 years. Well, we can have that contract be active for 2 years as we're executing maybe a project or we're building an asset. And at the end of that period, we actually want to start to start the clock on the retention and eventually perform that disposition review. In terms of the retention policy side of things, the policy is published to a location and applies to all content within the location. So just across the top here, we have Exchange, which is the E logo there. We have SharePoint. We have the Office 365 groups. If you're using Yammer, it's there as well. And then, of course, Teams. And Teams, just as a sidebar, is one of those areas that we've seen cause a ton of sprawl in the organization right now. So every time you create a new team, it creates a site in the background. That site, as you share documents through the team, will start to compile and build documentation there that are shared, and seldom that's not governed. So it's sitting there ungoverned, and it's a problem when somebody goes and kind of peeks behind the curtains and goes, oh, there's a lot of stuff here that we didn't expect. And the culprit is team sharing, which is really convenient, but you do have to have that governance on the back side of it. The label policy is published or auto applied to a specific location and classified items within it. So in Exchange and SharePoint, we can do a doc library. We're able to publish that within that location. OneDrive's the other icon there with the cloud. We're able to publish that policy there as well and look at some of the auto apply capabilities. So retention policy versus label policy. So if a label policy is applied, it can be published or auto applied to that location. It's visible to the end users in the user interface and allows them to apply it to an item as well. If we are doing auto applied, the retention label will be automatically applied to an item based on the conditions you supply as well. Jumping into the retention action side of things. So when we're going through and actually performing the retention actions, there's certain, actions or activities that the retention label can take. And some of these, I kind of chuckle at because I'm not sure how they were created, but retain then do nothing. I always kind of chuckle at this because came through the records management side of things. So we're going to keep all sales emails for 3 years, and then we're not going to do anything. We're just going to let the masses take over and do what they want. If they want to delete it, fine. We can also retain forever, which seems a little more valuable than doing nothing. But those are that permanent record scenario. So we can retain all the board meeting minutes forever, and then carry on and maybe archive those into a lower cost method of storage if we're paying for online storage. We can retain and delete. So we can retain all Teams chats for executives for a number of years and then remove them with no review. So maybe we don't want to actually go through a formal review on that. If you're going to take that path, you want to make sure you have a really solid information management policy signed off by your leadership teams to make sure that that is okay. Short story on that, I worked in a pipeline utility organization. They did a 90-day rule on emails. It wasn't classified, it was gone in 90 days. And the records manager fought tooth and nail with the executive team on getting that policy passed. Once it was passed, if your emails were there on the 91st day, they were gone. It didn't matter who you were in the organization, that policy was ironclad and worked very effectively, even though some folks weren't too happy with that. So you can retain and delete with no review. You can delete only. So if we're just going to delete things after 30 days, let's say we're going to do that with Teams chats, they can be deleted earlier by an end user if you so choose. So you don't want to retain anything. It's just, I want to delete that message. I want to delete that chat. You can enable that level of function from an end user. We just want to label things. So we just want to label something with retention. We're not actually going to go through. We're just going to classify or just classify the labeled items. The more common ones are we actually want to retain something and then perform an action later with it. We actually want to put this through a formal review. So one of the newer features that came out, which I'll talk about in the next few slides here, is the ability to launch a disposition review, which has been there, but to actually do that with a Power Automate flow. So if you've been familiar with other products like OpenText, they have two kinds of disposition reviews. They have a standard review, which is send a person one or group one, send a person two after that or group two, and that's the end. And then they actually had a workflow engine behind it where you could say do an advanced review and build a whole flow chart and flow around that. Well, 365 and Purview now has kind of leveled up their game to match that functionality. So you're able to go through and use Power Automate, the flow capabilities there, and go through a formal workflow, potentially even apply a different label at the end of the retention period. So we've seen this work. We've went through some disposition schedules where they go from active to semi-active or active to archive to destruction. That kind of stem from the physical world where you take it from the department filing cabinet, you'd move it into a file room formally that less people had access to. Then you may archive it off-site with an Iron Mountain or a different records provider, or as a permanent record and you retained it forever. So you kind of daisy chain the retention now through Power Automate and through the labeling mechanisms inside of Purview. So it's starting to build all those edge case scenarios that would come up and would be a little stickier trying to go and do records in this system a number of years back. So when we're going to go through and perform that Power Automate flow at the end of the retention period, you can run that custom disposition approval process. So for example, if I worked in a municipality, we would send the records for destruction approval to a records representative in each department. We had 20 plus departments. So we would kind of spider out that approval process. We may go through all the legal records at once and all the facilities records another time and send that off to a single person in that department. When that person, our records representative, approved it, it would go off to the next person, and that may be a director or somebody else, and then it would circle back to the records manager, more of a central location or central function that would go through and actually perform the destruction or hit the button in the system on them. We want to notify the document owner before deletion. That's an option as well. Do you actually want to notify them? Again, how strong is your policy and how transparent are you going to be in asking for approval to do destruction? We may want to do something like move the item to a centralized archive site. So if we're going through and maybe we built an asset, we went through, the asset's now operating, and we actually want to take all the project material from that, the correspondence that was saved in the project site. We want to save all the invoicing and all that, and we actually want to archive that off somewhere. We can use Power Automate and Flow to do that at a certain point of the retention period. Another example that was like selective retention. We have a selective retention and we want to move that into a different area. We can do that with this new function inside of Purview. And then what we usually need is we need a certificate of destruction if we're going through and doing the destruction side of things. So I actually want to go through and create a certificate of destruction with a listing. Almost, if you're old enough to remember, the fax cover sheet was a really good example of a visualization of that, where we have that listing of everything that went through in destruction. It's really, really formal in the physical record side of things, of course, because you're calling that shred truck or another service to provide the destruction. On the electronic side, sometimes it can be a little lacking, but you can use the flow capabilities in Power Automate to do that as well. Types of retention labels. And just to pause, I think we had a question popping up here. It's a licensing question. We'll save that one till the end. Types of retention labels. So don't let this slide fool you. Although it's broken into quadrants, there are 3 types of retention labels. And these are determined during the label creation stage, and they can't be changed once they're saved. So the 3 types of labels: regular label, top left, record label, and a regulatory record label. Now, record label can be both locked and unlocked. It's a bit counterintuitive. I'll get to it in the next slide that kind of explains it a little better. But a regular label, we can do things like retain items even if user deletes it. Regulatory record label is by far the most strict, and I will even say seldom used in the projects, even if we're involved in an organization that is regulated, which is usually the case when we're going through and doing formal records management. If you're going through and putting a regulatory record label on something, you can't delete the label after it's created. You'll only be able to increase the retention period or publish it to other locations. So if you're at the mercy of one of the state agencies that is pushing out a retention schedule all the time, so we've done some work in Washington State, they push out the retention schedule, all the municipalities have to adhere to that. If they make a change on that to say, oh, instead of the traditional 6 years, now we're going down to 5, you actually can't go back and change this. You can only extend the regulatory record label. So you're kind of boxed in and trusting that and assuming that the retention will only end up longer and never go shorter. So just kind of an FYI, something to caution if you're going to set this up. Just make sure that you can't remove the label or shorten that retention period. You're locked in for that time period. Kind of to visualize this between the 4 different scenarios here with the 3 record labels. This is a slide. You're going to get the whole presentation here in a PDF format, but this is probably one of the slides you want to keep handy if you're going through Purview. Just kind of understand the differences between them. So there's a few kind of caveats there. Can you move it across containers if it's never been if it's a record label and it's locked? And it's yes if it's never been unlocked. So there's a few kind of logical if then else scenarios that come in here. So can we change the retention label on a file for record labels that are unlocked? Yes, but to perform the action, you need to have specific roles the container admin know. There's a few different scenarios you can get yourself into. So you really want to think through these as you're determining which label to apply. At a higher level, there's some tenant level retention settings that you should walk away with and think through if you're starting your journey into governing the organization through Purview and generally just SharePoint, OneDrive, and 365. So should users in OneDrive or SharePoint be allowed to delete labeled items? So these are high level settings. You're gonna have to probably talk with IT and whoever's in charge of having the keys to that area. Can they update files once they've been deemed a record? Are they allowed to version things? And we're not talking about legal holds here or anything like that. We're just talking about when they've been deemed a record. An example of that is I have a site, I have a doc library in a site, I move some content in as an end user, it automatically puts a retention label on them. So I end up with a bunch of records that I thought were documents. Am I allowed to go in there and version these as records? Once a file is a record, should users be able to edit the properties? Can they edit the metadata on them? So I generally like this one to be a yes. Some other ECM systems have had this as a sub property per item. I like to see the metadata editable, and the reason is, let's use the contract example. I have a contract end date retention schedule. So contract end date, let's say +5 years. And the vendor's delayed doing what they needed to do. So I thought they're going to be done at the end of September. Now it's going to be the end of November. I want to be able to go in there and change that metadata field for 2 reasons. One, as an end user, that's an important date that I use in my job filtering and determining what I need to do with this contract. And 2, we can piggyback that metadata field for the retention schedule. So we can calculate off of that as well. That puts the onus on the end user to supply that field. Maybe we make it required. And it also gives us a compliance check mark on our side because we're able to calculate the retention based off of that field as well. Another one is, do we want to have custom disposition review messages and reminders? So what is the level of involvement from both a system perspective and holistically from an end user perspective on approving the destruction of records? Who are we going to pester in the departments? Are we taking a stance, even though this isn't a setting, but are we taking a stance as an IM or RM department to say, we're deeming it approved unless they say otherwise, and then we'll put it on a legal hold. So you pull your IM and RM policy out, review that, and then determine which settings we're going to flip in the system, and also who should be involved from approving destruction of records on the departmental side of things. So tenant level settings, this is probably step one before you get into the other slides, but just kind of understanding these. And if you have questions on this, my contact information is going to be on one of the later slides, and happy to answer those offline as well. So transitioning into the M365 file plan now, there's a couple of ways to do this. One is get your keyboard and mouse out and go one by one by one. So we want to essentially map that retention schedule into the parameters of the M365 file plan. And there's two ways: do it on bulk or painstakingly do it one by one. If you have a larger retention schedule, meaning you're breaking 1,000 items, you're never going to want to do this one by one. So you can actually go through and do a bulk upload. So there's specific CSV files you need to do that. We've done this a dozen times now. We're building out the retention schedule into that CSV format, moving it into the M365 file plan side of things. And we have a few templates and things we can do that with, but it's essentially Purview CSV format. So we can retain that, so we can build that retention schedule into the Purview side of things. So step one, generally for us, we follow this guide. We transform the existing retention schedule into the CSV format. One of the things we actually run into, and I think most practitioners run into, is the retention schedule electronic ready? So when we have things like selective retention on a retention schedule, it can cause compatibility issues when you move into any electronic records keeping system. So what is selective retention in electronic? What is superseded? Are we considering that version 2 of a document? Are we considering that was the 2022 HR policy? Now we have the 2023 HR policy. So how are we closing out that record? We need to make sure that if we're closing out that record on what was superseded previously, we're going to have that as a metadata field of inactive, legacy policy, whatever it may be. So we can start the disposition side of things and have the retention schedule attached appropriately. That information needs to go into a spreadsheet like this, so it can be uploaded into the actual Purview, brain in terms of the retention schedule side of things. So it can be a little tricky. There's always some, wiggling of that retention schedule if you're coming off of the physical side of things. Moving straight into the electronic side, there needs to be a little bit of modification. After we have that electronic ready and we're ready to move it into Purview formally, this is kind of what it looks like after it's been loaded. So if you want to do this manually, there's a create label button up here. You can go through and create all the labels manually. When you're done creating the labels, you actually have to go through and publish the labels, and it can take up to a week to publish labels. Now, personally, I haven't seen it take a week, but it can as you go through that, and generally just you're importing and exporting them on mass there. So something to keep in mind, but there is a way of doing this on mass without needing to go through and actually do this one by one on your large retention schedule. Label application methods. So our goal is to seamlessly apply those retention labels to documents. And how are we going to end up doing that? So we want to make sure that when we're going through and performing the classification side of things, there's a couple different, practical methods to do this. One is manual classification. I think we've all been there with users. It's prone to error. There's a much lower classification success rate. They're just usually going to pick one of the first ones in the box. Admin general was a culprit for decades. They would pick that one, create a big mess, and eventually somebody had to go and clean up that mess. And it wasn't end users, it was usually a poor records manager that had to do that. It's prone to error. I'd say it's prone to frustration, and just they're apathetic to it. Users generally don't want to do that. They don't really care. It's not part of their job, and they just move on. But it's really easy to deploy. You can just put it out there and say, hey, everybody, let's make this a team project, and let's classify those records together, and we'll, you know, kind of wash our hands of that and move on. So not great. What's been used, I'd say, much more frequently in the last 10 to 15 years is defaulted classification. Take all systems out of this, just a general records discussion. You got a higher classification rate. You're building the records classification into some kind of information architecture. So you got your folders in SharePoint, you got your doc libraries and your sites. Inside of those doc libraries, you're going to have different metadata required, different permissioning on those libraries and sites, which essentially turns into your information architecture. With that architecture, we end up kind of deploying that all at once, attaching the retention schedule to different components on that. And it generally covers a good chunk of the cases, about 80% of use. 80% of the time we see that as the chosen method. So ends up being really impactful. Again, to my earlier point, the problem we put in front of the users and how we train them is, where do I put my stuff? If they know where to put their stuff, you can easily default the classification on that area if you have a healthy information architecture. And the propagation and inheritance of retention will take over without the user really needing to do much. There's a careful balance in required metadata versus convenience metadata. And that's always a discussion point with some of the practitioners that are in the industry that we meet at the conferences and stuff. There's a few individuals that just like a ton of metadata. My personal opinion on that is, unless we're going to do records management on a piece of metadata, we're going to do reporting on a piece of metadata, or we're going to do advanced searching on it, generally we don't need it. It stemmed from a lot of the lack of system functionality in the search side, which ended up causing things like really strict naming conventions of files because you couldn't find things. But now with search, being able to go inside the document and do a full text search and bring that back for either e-discovery purposes, just general searching and convenience purposes for how I do my day job, I don't need to have a convoluted file name, and I don't need to have a whole bunch of metadata fields, because my ingrained behavior now with all those years of Google is go up to the search bar, type in what I want, see if I can find it. If I can't find it, refine my search, maybe type in a different term or get more discreetly. And after that, generally, I just complain if I can't find it and go ask somebody. So that's really what it takes, as opposed to building out all those metadata fields, making them required. And when a user puts in a batch of documents, they're putting in all that different information. Valuable, but a careful balance there if we're going in the default classification or defaulted classification method in an information architecture. Watch your metadata doesn't go too wide in terms of the number of fields. Auto classification is, I'll say, newer within the last 5 years and definitely improving a lot. It's flexible to a changing information architecture. It's definitely best for event-based retention. So if we can auto classify things, that's great. It is much harder to deploy. There's a lot of training the machine up front to make sure it's accurate. And it's used in roughly 20-ish% of the projects or use cases we see. The presentation I'll be giving next Thursday with ARMA is going to cover a lot of this. Auto classifying your records. We went through and did a very large pilot with a government agency on just test driving the technology to make sure it can do what's expected from the record side of things for identifying and classifying documents into records as they're put into the system. So that's kind of a teaser for next week. But one way that it will be much more impactful, and it really draws a lot of attention from IT in a good way as well. They're very interested in this. So from Microsoft, it's a product called Syntex. Think of it like a Captiva or a Kofax or one of those auto classification document identification tools, and we're spinning that into a records use case. On the defaulted classification side of things, just some kind of tidbits in here. If you're in SharePoint and you have that discrete library already, and you know that everything in this library should have this retention on it, you can apply labels to items in that list or library. So you can actually go grab one of those items you published in Purview, apply it directly on that. So if you have a contracts area or you have a invoices area and you know that everything in that area is all one, it's a fairly easy activity. So we want to retain this for a number of years. Look at your metadata side of things if you're needing to retain based on a specific metadata field, or you're okay with maybe the create date or a standard date in there. And you can apply it just en masse to that, and take a quick win and check one off the board for you on that side of things. If, however, the retention label is already applied on a document, the auto apply process will not override the label, even if the condition is met. So what that means is, let's say I have a document in another library and I move it into here, and now it's trying to do an auto apply won't supersede or override that record that's moving to that location. If we're doing this in kind of a more visual approach with an information architecture, so we may end up with a hub site, maybe it's a client, a team site for the procurement side of things. And then we have a vendor side and a policy and procedure side. And on the vendor side of things in the doc library, we have contracts area, policies and procedures. We have that for procurement. And underneath the contract side of things, we have a folder for our first vendor, Acme, and then we have subfolders. Maybe we have MSAs, statements of work, supply agreements, whatever they may be. You can apply the retention label up here, just at the between the site and the doc library level, and really reap the benefit from everything underneath. So that's the default declassification side and kind of where you put that. And that was shown just previously here as well, how we're able to do that at a doc library level or higher. In terms of auto classification, so we have the flexibility to have that changing information architecture. So if you design one, of course, waterfall approach, you do it all at once. And it's maybe not well accepted by users 2-3 years down the road. Businesses have changed. Maybe your reorg happens in governments. It seems like sometimes when there's elections, they merge or separate departments in different state or ministry offices, which can make it harder to deploy and essentially just create a bit of pain for the governance folks. So we can auto apply based on content type. So we can build those rules in, whether that's a SharePoint content type. We can also go through and set the auto application based on metadata type. So if we have column types, choice, manage metadata, dates, numbers, and then looking at the expiration side of things. So if we want the expiry date to be less than the current date and the file type has to be this, and you can build that logic out. That does give us the ability to do all that in an auto classified style. In addition to this, next week, as I mentioned, I'll be showing off Syntax from Microsoft, which kind of does this on a whole different scale across content everywhere, and really gives you a lot of horsepower for automating different processes in addition to performing records management. So just to kind of summarize the 3 types again, we have the manual classification. I should just put a big don't do this across the board there. The default declassification, and then the auto classification side. So to kind of start to wrap this one up, the things we covered today in an absolute speedy fashion was understanding the policy and label differences, going through the retention actions and the different types of retention labels, transitioning and how you can actually get that into the M365 file plan, and going through the label and the application methods around it. So those 3 types, the manual, the inherited or the classified auto inherited, and the auto classification. Now we'll open this up for Q&A in a bit. I'll just go through a few kind of wrap-up slides here. So if you are going to ARMA InfoCon, we're hosting an event at a place called The Vault, probably the most appropriate, we'll say, location you can have to have a few beverages. So if you're interested in that, this will be in the slide deck as well, or you can scan that QR code and fill out a brief form so we can get you a ticket to that. It's on the Tuesday night just before the Henry Ford Museum, which Heather advocates is going to be one of the best museums in the country. So I'm looking forward to that. If you want to learn more around the Purview side of things, we actually have a team here that delivers Purview training. They're in training this week. And the difference with our training versus others, and I've sat another training, I've paid for other training, is ours is hands-on. So we find that it's great to sit through presentations like this from a general lecture knowledge level, but until you try it yourself, it's not as impactful. So we actually run this over the course of 4 half days. So you get kind of a breather, able to absorb some of the knowledge, try some things out, do your day job, come back the next day and participate in round 2 of the training and kind of progress all the way through this. So the slides you saw today are a taste of that, goes a lot deeper. And into the hands-on side of things, where we give you a lab environment to try things out for the week of training and a week after as well. So one of our, say, industry offerings. I'll open it up for questions, but I'll just leave the thank you slide up here with my contact information. So we won't end it yet, Heather. I think I ran a little bit ahead of schedule. I went full speed there. So if there are questions, I'll maybe jump into the Q&A and answer those. So if you want to put your questions in there. If you do want to contact me, it's just jordan@cadenceSolutions.ca. We have a team of us here on the M365 side that can answer those more complicated ones or set up a time to chat. So Heather, any other remarks before I jump into Q&A?
No, go right ahead.
Excellent. So if I pull Q&A up, can you see it on the screen, or is it all?
No, only you can see those questions. So you would need to read the question and then answer.
All right, so question from Daniel. Given that we have an A3 license, and we want to subscribe to an A5 compliance license, do we need to buy as many licenses as we have users? So first off on that question, I mentioned the E3 license. There's also an A3 license. A is for academic, so usually higher education or K to 12. For you, Daniel, you can bump from A3 to A3 security and compliance if you just want to add it on for that. When you say as many licenses as we have users, it'll be depending on the users that are going to add content to the area. So if I have a doc library that is something like HR policies and the users are just consuming that content, I do not believe you'd have to go buy a license for those users. So let's say, looks like you're in the academic side of things. Let's say it's all the facilities workers. They may not be putting content into that area, but consuming it. They should be okay with an A3 license. The licensing thing is a constant moving game in terms of why partners don't really play in it, because it's done by the Microsoft mothership there on the licensing side. So probably best to even follow up with the rep there and have that. Next one's in from Kathy. Does Purview have an out-of-the-box workflow for retention disposition, or are you creating a flow from scratch using Power Automate? So Purview does have an out-of-the-box quote-unquote workflow for retention disposition. It is not what I would consider an advanced workflow. So we'll send it off to a few reviewers. They will get a review pane with the documents or records that are up for review, including a preview of it. And they will get the ability to approve the destruction of that. I like the Power Automate side, although it is from scratch. It does give the users a lot different experience, and it actually lets you push the task into Teams on the desktop side. So you can actually have an approvals pane in Teams that says, Jordan, you have something to approve, and you click it, and it can bring up that flow. So that is a pretty big benefit, I think, as opposed to using the out-of-the-box function. So they came out with the out-of-the-box, and then 3, 4, 5 years later, they came out with the flow integration with Power Automate. So I would lean that way. And I think we even have some webinars on our site that will show the Power Automate side of things. Greg asked if we offer training on e-discovery capabilities of Purview Premium. Not yet, Greg. We're looking into doing that. Love to hear any of your feedback on what's in demand for that, as opposed to our take on it. I will be going through e-discovery at InfoCon on the Tuesday, just before I go off to the vault for a beverage to do the e-discovery kind of show and tell, and that'll be a full demo, not a PowerPoint deck. Rebecca, are you going to discuss the preservation hold library in these sessions? We'd like to know more on this. What you've done with other organizations and such. So I'll touch on that briefly now. I might be able to squeeze a few slides in on that, maybe even not the next one, but the October one. So preservation hold library in general is this like hidden keeping area where you can let your users feel like they deleted a document or record, but it actually sits in a separate library. And in that separate library, you can actually perform your destruction and disposition out of there. So it gives users this kind of their own world where they can feel like they're cleaning up everything, but it's still residing in this special library, even though it's not on a hold. It's on a hold as in legal hold. It's sitting there in a holding place. So you as a records manager or the organization's governance team can go through and perform disposition appropriately. So it's a bit of a mind shift for a lot of people, because even in the traditional ECM systems, gone is gone. A user deletes it, it's gone. Usually protect in place. File shares, same thing. You remove it off the file share. They don't want to look at something anymore. It's gone. So it's a different concept, I guess. Definitely one that I had to wrap my head around. That we utilize with some organizations. So Rebecca, maybe email me separately and we can have a conversation on that as well. Anonymous, Mr. or Mrs. Anonymous, does Purview offer full text search capability? So yes, number one, SharePoint offers full text search capability. Number two, Purview does. And if you want to use that on the e-discovery side of things, you can say, for example, give me every document or email from within my tenant, so all my Microsoft 365 users, that contains the word Acme Incorporated, because we're going into litigation with Acme Incorporated because they didn't do such great work. And I want to extract all that into one place. So if we're looking at that from an e-discovery side of things, we want to get that into a collection on the e-discovery side, so we can export that maybe for outside counsel or somebody else to review and go through the collection. On the Purview side of things, full text can be done with KQL as well, which is a keyword query language. That's kind of the 201 level of what we went through today to go through and perform auto classification on some of that as well. Just reading one from another anonymous. For indefinite records that you would like to reach out to the business units to verify these are still needed, is there any reporting within the disposition process that identifies who applied the retention label? So this is going to come back to the starting point. So if you're going with the manually classified, you can have so-and-so tag the label and user. We don't advise that. Otherwise, if you're using the inherited classification style of records, the who would be the system. So there wouldn't be a hook back to a person. Now, I like to bring it always back to that. Do they know where to put their stuff? Do they know where to file that information? And if they're filing it appropriately and you have the inheritance principle of labels pushing down onto those documents, turning into records, that's a very easy way for you to be confident that you have the appropriate disposition or the retention schedule on that. So when it comes to disposition, whether it's timed or permanent, you can perform the appropriate action. Now, if you made the mistake up front by going manual or mislabeled an area or users didn't file appropriately, you're into a bit of a conundrum, because you may be flipping through like you would do on the paper side of things to undo or verify that this is the appropriate retention. Kathleen asks, will the presentation be sent to all attendees? I believe so, Heather.
Yes, I can confirm. We are going to be sending the recording to everybody who's on the line today. So thank you so much for being here. You will be able to watch again.
I got Tyler asking a question. Is there a use case for leveraging sensitivity labels as visual markers on SharePoint files that have a document property, compliance tag, or something like that? We use sensitivity labels even internally here. We use it on the human resources side of things for social security or social insurance numbers. And the reason I really like it is it can be a visual marker not only beside the document or record in the doc library as a column, but it can also be a tooltip that flies across the Word document as you're actually putting in something that's sensitive. So let's say I hire Heather, I open her employee file, I'm typing in all her information, and I type in her social security number. The system will actually fire off and say, ping, PII is now in this file. We've given it the sensitivity label of confidential. This cannot be shared, blah, blah, blah. And it'll give you the whole list of rules. It's a tooltip that you actually configure through the Purview side of things, and one that you can customize the message inside of that. So I do like using that. It is a great feature from an information governance, not necessarily a records retention, and IT and RM start to kind of blend into each other in this space, because now you're dealing with quote unquote security-ish stuff as you're also looking at sensitivity of information. Mark that one as answered. Rodney, records managers in our organization have E3 licenses. Would an E5 be required for a department records coordinator to review content that is up for disposition? I'll have to take that one away, Rodney. I don't know that one offhand. We have Anonymous asking about Knowledge Lake. I don't know anything about Knowledge Lake as a product. We'd have to dig into that one as well. Have I missed any? I guess I have to click done when I'm done them, otherwise they don't disappear, Heather. So
Right.
I'm more of a Teams guy here. Sorry, not a Zoom guy. But
and there is a last one that just came in.
Is there a way to call down the retention labels, retention label types? So a person would have to apply, so they don't have a list of 200 labels to select from. I think that goes back to, I sound like a broken record, but let's not have users pick them. I know the records folks are going to have to pick them to put them as a default on there. Yes, it's a little messy, but not that I know of at this point. Is there a way to call them down from a SharePoint user interface, Purview user interface side of things? Be nice if they had a filter box with some IntelliSense where you start typing and they filter down.
Yeah. Well, Jordan, I think that looks like most of the questions that we've have here today. And as we're wrapping up, just thank you so much to everybody for attending today. Thank you, Jordan, for being here. And we'll see everybody next week for part 2. Learn how to unleash the power of content AI and automatic classification using syntax for legacy reposition. And a quick reminder, slides will be provided in a follow-up email. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to email us at education@armaintl.org. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. Take care.